Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be exploring some forgotten murder cases. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we delve into historical cases you may not have heard of. First on the list today, the brutal murder of Jenny Boser. Jenny Boser was a 17-year-old girl who was tragically raped and murdered in Paterson, New Jersey on October 19, 1900. Martinsje Jenny Boser was born on April 21, 1883 in Melisson, South Holland, Netherlands. She was the second daughter of Johannes John Boser and his second wife, Dina Caslander Boser, and had 7 siblings. When Jenny was 7, her family emigrated to America, settling in Paterson, New Jersey, around 1890. At the time of her murder, she lived with her parents at 155 East 5th Street in the Riverside area and worked at the Paterson Ribbon Company on Vreeland Avenue. On October 18, 1900, at around 8 p.m., Jenny left home to buy baby powder for her young niece at the drugstore. There, she encountered William A. Death, pronounced Death, and Andrew Campbell. Jenny had previously dated Death, but he had abruptly ended their relationship 5 weeks earlier to marry someone else. After a brief conversation, she went into the store. While she was inside, Walter McAllister, a wealthy young man, approached Death and suggested he invite Jenny to Saul's Saloon, located nearby at the corner of River Street and Bridge Street. Death convinced Jenny to join him and Campbell at the saloon. While there, McAllister appeared to drop by unexpectedly, and when Jenny's back was turned, he secretly added chloral hydrate to her absinthe frap. When she didn't pass out right away, he added a second, lethal dose. Once Jenny lost consciousness, McAllister called his friend George, who was waiting at a nearby hotel, and hired a cab for the group. They took Jenny to a secluded location where she was raped, and she died during the assault due to the effects of the drug. When the men realized they couldn't revive her, they panicked and sought help from a doctor, who came outside and confirmed Jenny's death. At the doctor's urging, the men took the girl's body with them. Jenny was discovered a few hours later, lying a short distance from the Waggaroa Bridge, now known as the Lincoln Bridge, on the Bergen County side of the Passaic River, in the Columbia Heights section of what is now Fair Lawn, between 5:30 and 6:15 a.m. Marinus Gary found her while on his way to work. Her head was resting on a jagged rock, and there was a fracture at the base of her skull. Initially, this fracture was thought to be the cause of death, but it was later determined that the injury occurred after she had died. According to some reports describing her body, she appeared to be sleeping. She was lying on her back with her hands at her sides, palms down, and fingers relaxed. One leg was crossed over the other at the ankle, and her dress was undisturbed, lying flat. The coroner estimated that her time of death was 2 to 3 hours prior to the discovery. A carriage driver named Augustus Sculthorpe came forward to the police, providing a crucial lead in the case. According to his report, Sculthorpe stated that on October 19th, he was summoned to Saul's Saloon, where he witnessed 4 men carrying an unconscious girl to his coach at midnight. He drove them to a closed roadhouse and then started heading back toward Paterson. Along the way, the girl was removed from the carriage and ill-treated. George J. Kerr, Walter C. McAllister, Andrew J. Campbell, and William A. Death were indicted for her murder and arraigned on November 17, 1900, in front of Judge Dixon. The city of Paterson was left in shock. McAllister came from a wealthy and respected family, known for owning several businesses and employing a significant number of residents at their mills and breweries. His father, who had spent decades building his reputation in the community, felt so humiliated by the allegations that he offered his son stern advice, which was later published in local newspapers. George Kerr's family was similarly affluent. His father was a devout man, with George's brother John serving as a judge, and his brother-in-law as the mayor of Paterson. At the time of the attack, George was married, and his wife was 8 months pregnant with their 6th child. Death had recently married into a prosperous family just over a month before the crime. Campbell, the youngest of the group, and from a working-class background, was well-regarded, with the most doubts surrounding his guilt. All 4 men pleaded not guilty, and the trial was scheduled for January 14th of the following year. Walter C. McAllister, Andrew J. Campbell, and William A. Death were tried together, while George Kerr was announced to be tried separately at the last minute. Some newspapers mistakenly reported that George had turned state's evidence, which was not true. He had not been present when the drug was administered to Jenny. Jenny's parents attended the trial, along with Death's young wife, Charlotte, Judge John Kerr, and others. During the proceedings, the defense attempted to attribute Jenny's death to the absinthe rather than the overdose of chloral hydrate. They blamed her parents for allowing her to go out and accused Jenny of accepting the men's invitation, suggesting she had victimized those accused of her murder. However, the jury found that her death was not caused by the absinthe and that the murder was premeditated. The men were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years of hard labor. Initially, George pleaded not guilty, but after the others were found guilty, he changed his plea to non volt contendere, no contest, regarding the rape charge and received a 15-year sentence of hard labor. All 4 sentences were the maximum allowed by law, and their appeals were denied. Jenny's murder garnered national media attention for months following her death. The scandalous circumstances surrounding her killing and the power dynamics between her and her attackers fueled much of the public interest. Jenny was a working-class girl, while her assailants were wealthy and influential. On March 12, 1901, a potential copycat crime occurred when Mary Page was drugged, raped, and discovered in a severely ill state, though she did recover. 3 boys were convicted of assault in connection with this incident and received relatively short sentences. 2. James C. Dunham took the lives of his wife, her family, and 2 servants in Campbell, California. James C. Dunham was married to Hattie Wells Dunham. They lived in Campbell, California. The couple were both bicyclists and had only 1 child, and as generally, James was polite and eager to expand his knowledge. Throughout his life, he worked in various roles, including nurseryman, drummer, bicycle agent, confectioner, and orchardist. At the time of the murders, he was studying law. On May 26, 1896, he was staying at his father-in-law, Colonel McGlinchey's home, located in the countryside a short distance from San Jose, California. That evening, Colonel McGlinchey, along with Jazz Wells, Mrs. McGlinchey's son from a previous marriage, and their hired hand, George Shable, drove to a nearby village named Campbell, returning around 11:30 p.m. After unhitching the horse and putting the buggy away in the barn, McGlinchey and Wells went to the house, leaving Shable in the stable. Shortly after their arrival, Shable heard several gunshots, followed by McGlinchey rushing out of the house and running toward a chicken coop, with Dunham in pursuit and brandishing a pistol. Dunham fired multiple shots into the building, and McGlinchey, who had been hit, emerged pleading for mercy. He then collapsed on the ground, where Dunham shot him fatally. Shable hid in the hay while Dunham searched for him. Unable to find him, Dunham saddled a horse and rode off, still armed. Elsie Ross, a neighbor of the McGlincheys, heard the initial shots and quickly dressed before running to their home. Upon discovering McGlinchey's body in the yard, he rushed back to get a shotgun, and while on his way, he heard a horse galloping down the road. After arming himself, he woke another neighbor named Page, and together they headed to the McGlinchey home. Upon arrival at midnight, they were met with a horrifying scene. In addition to McGlinchey's body in the yard, they found Wells shot dead inside the house. Mrs. McGlinchey and her daughter, the murderer's wife, had been stabbed to death, while 2 employees, Minnie Schessler and Robert Briscoe, were brutally attacked with a hatchet, rendering their bodies nearly unrecognizable. The only survivor in the vicinity was Dunham's own infant, barely a month old. The state of the house suggested a violent struggle had taken place. Blood splattered the walls, and furniture and decor were overturned and broken. As Dunham rode away from the gruesome scene, he encountered Charles Sterrett on the San Jose Road. Still holding his revolver, Dunham asked Sterrett where he was headed and whom he was seeking. He was next seen the following evening at 6:30 p.m., conversing with manager Snell of the Smiths Creek Hotel. Dunham was bloodstained and his horse was nearly spent from fatigue. He then rode off toward the mountains, and no further trace of him was found until May 29th, when his abandoned horse was discovered in Indian Gulch, 5 miles from Mount Hamilton. A reward of $2,200 was offered for Dunham's capture. People from across the United States frequently reported sightings of the fugitive, leading to significant expenses for the authorities as they investigated these false leads. The most notable case of mistaken identity occurred on September 5, 1908, when a woman in Sherman, Texas claimed to know Dunham and identified a local man named William Hatfield as the wanted murderer. He was arrested, but his explanations of his whereabouts before and after the murder were unsatisfactory. Sheriff Langford from Santa Clara County traveled to Texas, and after a legal struggle marked by jealousy over the reward money, the suspect was ultimately extradited. On October 23rd, Hatfield arrived in San Jose, where it was conclusively established that he was not the wanted man. However, he had to be charged, but he was legally cleared shortly thereafter. The motive behind Dunham's heinous act was never clearly determined. There was no evidence to suggest it was premeditated. Rather, it is widely believed that he acted out of some actual or perceived grievance. His reportedly uncontrollable temper may have momentarily transformed him into a fiend. It seems unlikely that Dunham could have escaped or survived for long after his horse collapsed from exhaustion. His name, description, and deeds were on everyone's lips in the region, and anyone fitting his description was detained for investigation unless their identity could be definitively established. Without any means to disguise himself and lacking provisions, he never sought food or shelter from anyone. It would have been impossible for anyone to navigate the mountainous terrain without proper nourishment. Every possible escape route was monitored, either by law enforcement or by those eager to aid in his capture, motivated by justice or the substantial reward. Dunham, naturally melancholic, was alone and exhausted in the remote mountains, hunted like a wild animal. With no way out and the certainty of facing the gallows if caught, he likely recognized the gravity of his crimes. Possessing more than average intelligence, he may have chosen to find a secluded spot where he ultimately ended his troubled life. 3. The murder of Chrissy Venn. Chrissy Claire Venn was born on July 25, 1907. She was an Australian girl whose tragic murders occurred just outside the village of North Motton, near Overstone, Tasmania. On Saturday, February 26, 1921, around 5 p.m., the beautiful 13-year-old Chrissy Venn left her mother's home, located among farmland and lush forests about 3 miles from North Motton, to run some errands in the village. Not long after, John Herbst Jr., known as Jack, and his brother, sons of the prominent local farmer and landowner John Herbst Sr., were working in a field on their family farm when they heard a single, high-pitched scream coming from the nearby woods. They chose not to investigate. When Chrissy hadn't returned by 7 p.m., her mother began searching along the road, but found no trace of her. The following day, members of the small bushland farming community organized a large search for the missing girl. Chrissy was described as well-developed for her age, with a figure that resembled that of an adult rather than a child. By 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, March 1st, the search was focused on a deep ravine about half a mile from Chrissy's home, near the field where John Herbst Sr.'s sons had been working when they heard the scream. One of the searchers, John Herbst Jr., the same young man who heard the scream on the day of the murder, thought to check inside one of the large tree stumps scattered throughout the area, remnants of past logging of massive eucalypts and pine trees. This led another searcher to climb a different stump, which yielded no results. However, while doing so, he noticed another stump nearby and decided to investigate it. This charred stump was 33 feet in circumference, over 9 feet high, and had a 16-inch wide hollow in the center. This time, the search reached a tragic conclusion. Chrissy Venn's body had been stuffed headfirst into this narrow hole. At the bottom of the hole, beneath Chrissy's body, were the basket she had been carrying, her handkerchief, a bottle that was in the basket, a cap, and her underclothing. The small amount of money her mother had given her was missing. A piece of hay baling wire, about a foot long, was tightly wrapped around her throat. Additionally, part of the dress she had worn that day, along with a brooch, was stuffed down her throat, which is believed to have caused her death by suffocation. While newspapers at the time were discreet in their reporting, court records indicate that Chrissy had been sexually assaulted, with sperm found in her private part. The coroner noted clear signs of a struggle, with evidence of a violent altercation present on her body and in an area approximately 12 yards from the stump where the attack was believed to have taken place. In that location, blood-stained pubic hair matching Chrissy's color was found, along with safety pins, pieces of bloody fabric, likely used as a sanitary pad, which may have been pinned to her underwear, and another piece of wire. A blood-stained stick was also discovered. A nearby gate leading to a field owned by the Herbst family was identified as the source of the wire found around Chrissy's throat, as portions of the wire had been recently cut. Suspicion quickly turned to local farm worker George William King, a 36-year-old married man with several children, who had participated in the search for Chrissy. Although he was in a different search party from the one that discovered her body, he was present when she was removed from the stump. King had several scratches on his hands, including one deep and fresh wound that appeared to be infected. He claimed he had sustained the injury during the search. King was well known to Chrissy's mother, having spent time at their home and often staying late into the night. Local residents informed the police that Chrissy had been afraid of King and had recently begun hiding from him, darting into the bush alongside the road whenever she spotted him approaching. King insisted he had no idea why she would act that way. The police became even more suspicious when King altered several details of his alibi. At the inquest into Chrissy's death, the jury concluded that Chrissy Venn was willfully murdered at North Mawton by an unknown person or persons. However, they believed the evidence against the accused, George William King, was strong enough to justify his committal for trial. The trial commenced on August 14th of that year and concluded on the 20th, resulting in the jury finding King not guilty. Shortly after the trial, the lead detective was dismissed for incompetence, having neglected to interview several viable suspects and focusing solely on King. The coroner's reputation suffered as well. During the 6 months between King's arrest and the trial, he demonstrated ineffectiveness in his role, failing to collect and preserve crucial evidence and frequently altering his findings, which rendered his testimony nearly worthless at trial. Chrissy was laid to rest at the North Mawton Methodist Cemetery, and local lore claims that her ghost haunts the area where she was murdered. To this day, Chrissy's murder remains unsolved. 4. Murder of Pearl Bryan. Pearl Bryan was born in 1874 to Alexander S. Bryan and Susan Jane Bryan. Her father was a respected farmer in their community. Pearl graduated from Greencastle High School, and at the time of her murder, she was 22 years old and had recently started working as a Sunday school teacher. On the morning of January 31st, 1896, Pearl Bryan boarded the New York Central train from Greencastle to Cincinnati, arriving at the 3rd and Central Station. She was there to meet her sweetheart, Scott Jackson, with hopes of marrying him, as she was pregnant. Jackson and his friend Alonzo Walling greeted her at the train, and the three walked along Central to 4th Street, then to Elm, where they became embroiled in a loud, heated argument. Jackson attempted to persuade Pearl to have an abortion, but she vehemently refused. As the men tried to calm her down, she angrily declared her intention to take the noon train back to Greencastle, where she planned to tell her brother everything, believing he would help set things right. Witnesses from the John Church Music Publishing Company, located at 4th and Elm Streets, later recounted the details of the argument during the trials. They had overheard the exchange through an open shipping room window. Although they did not know the identities of the three at the time, they later identified them in court as Pearl Bryan, Scott Jackson, and Alonzo Walling. Pearl did not take the train home that day as she had threatened. Instead, in the evening, the three of them visited the sitting room of Legner's Tavern at 4th and Plum Streets. Their arguing caught the attention of the porter, who later testified that he saw one of the men put something into Pearl's sarsaparilla, a popular soft drink at the time. It was later discovered that Jackson had purchased cocaine from a nearby drugstore, which was legal to sell without a prescription back then. During the trials, the only further events of that evening, mentioned by a witness, were recounted by a black coachman who operated near People's Corner. He testified that he was hired to pick up 2 men and a woman at 4th and Plum and take them to Kentucky. He noted that the woman who later got into his hack appeared either drugged or very ill. If the coachman was telling the truth, it suggested that the killing occurred in Kentucky. The men instructed him to drive across the bridge at the foot of Broadway, entering Newport at York Street, where they would give further directions. According to the coachman's account, they traveled south on York to 11th Street, then west to the streetcar barn at Lowell, before turning south onto Licking Pike. After passing by his grandfather Stegeman's old 76 Inches Distilling Company in Finchtown, and the Andrews Steel Mill in Wilders. Jackson, who seemed familiar with the area, directed him to go up Johns Hill Road. Upon reaching Alexandria Pike, they turned back north and continued along the pike until they arrived at the tragic location on the Locke farm. There was no evidence presented at the trials to suggest that any tolls were paid on the turnpike, indicating that it was likely well past midnight, with the gates open and the keepers asleep. As the northbound coach approached the southern tip of the triangular Locke property, where South Fort Thomas Avenue meets Alexandria Pike, the driver remained on the pike, descending the hill and passing the James Metcalf house, now the site of Woodville School, on his left. Throughout the journey, the girl in the back had been moaning consistently, but suddenly her cries grew louder, causing the cab driver to become increasingly alarmed. Just before reaching Grandview Avenue, he was instructed to stop the horse, and the two men helped the girl out of the carriage. As they made their way toward the fence supporting the incapacitated girl, the terrified coachman seized the reins and sped back to Cincinnati as fast as he could. What exactly happened next remains uncertain. Pearl Bryan may have died before the coach stopped, leading the men to carry her body to the fence, or they might have dragged her into the thicket on the hillside where the crime occurred. Whether she was dead or alive but incapacitated, Jackson and Walling would have faced a significant challenge getting up the steep hill. Even if there was a moon, the dense woods would have made it quite dark, necessitating a lantern, which one of the men likely carried. The same conspirator probably also had the girl's traveling bag, needed to transport her decapitated head. No witness ever came forward to say they had given anyone a ride into town that morning. The streetcars, which had stopped running at midnight, resumed service early the next morning. Surely, if a black man or two white men carrying a grip and a lantern had boarded near the end of the line, the motorman or conductor would have mentioned it, especially after the murder news broke. On the same day the body was found, February 1st, 1896, Jackson and Walling returned to Legner's Tavern at 4th and Plum in Cincinnati. They asked the bartender if they could leave a small leather grip with him until the following day. The bartender agreed but noticed the grip felt unusually heavy and asked if it contained a bowling ball. He received no response. The next night, Jackson retrieved the grip and later returned it empty. During Jackson's trial, Detective Krim pointed out to the jury that a dental college was only a few blocks away from the saloon and that the furnace not only heated the building but also served as an incinerator for burning rubbish. Jackson's trial commenced on April 21st and concluded on May 14, 1896. Walling's trial began on May 26 and wrapped up on June 18 of the same year. Both were found guilty of first-degree murder and were hanged on the morning of March 20, 1897, behind the Newport Campbell County Courthouse on York Street, just south of the Taylor-Southgate Bridge. Reports indicate that both Jackson and Walling survived the initial drop meant to break their necks, and instead were slowly strangled to death several minutes later. They were the last individuals executed by hanging in Newport, and the gallows behind the courthouse were dismantled following their execution. 5. The murder of Lily Lindstrom. Lily Lindstrom was a 32-year-old prostitute living in the Atlas area of Stockholm, Sweden. Her life, like many in her profession, was marked by hardship and struggle. On May 4, 1932, Lily was discovered dead in her apartment after her friend Minnie Jansen, a 35-year-old prostitute who lived one floor below, reported her missing to the police. Minnie detailed her last interactions with Lily, recalling that just a few days prior, Lily had knocked on her door asking for some condoms. Later that same evening, around 9 p.m., Lily returned to Minnie's door wearing nothing but a coat, an unusual sight that raised concerns for her safety. When the police arrived at Lily's apartment and received no response, they forced their way in. What they found was a scene of horror. Lily lay face down on her bed, lifeless. It was determined that she had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 days. Completely naked, her clothes were neatly folded on a chair beside the bed, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding her death. Disturbingly, a condom was discovered lodged in her anus, hinting at the violent and depraved circumstances of her demise. An autopsy revealed that Lily had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Additionally, saliva was found on her neck and various other parts of her body, suggesting a disturbing level of intimacy from her assailant. Most alarmingly, nearly all of her blood had been drained from her body, leading investigators to uncover a blood-stained gravy ladle near her corpse. This gruesome discovery led to the chilling moniker for her killer, the Atlas Vampire, a name that would haunt the city. Despite the abundance of evidence left at the scene, including hair and semen samples, as well as fingerprints, the police were hampered by the lack of DNA testing technology at the time. Investigators speculated that one of Lily's regular clients might have been involved in her murder. As a result, 9 of her clients were questioned, but none were charged, and no clear suspects emerged from the investigation. The identities of these clients were never disclosed by the police, and it remains uncertain whether Lily's ex-husband was ever considered a suspect in her death.